Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee in this bigger, grander room. So I hope our witnesses and guests at the back can hear us. I'm Florence Eshalomi. I'm the chair of the Select Committee. Can I ask my colleagues on the committee to introduce themselves, please?
I'm Chris Jennings. I'm Labour MP for Milton Keynes North.
Andrew Lewin, Labour MP for Welwyn Hatfield.
Michelle Khan, Labour MP for Gillingham and Rainham.
Joe Powell, Kensington and Bayswater.
Will Forster, MP for Woking.
Leader and MP for Newbury.
Can I ask our guests to introduce themselves, please?
I'm Councillor Adam Hugg. I'm here as the LGA's Housing and Planning spokesperson, and I'm also leader of Westminster City Council.
I'm Madeleine Jennings. I'm Head of Policy and Communications at Local Trust, which is a charity set up to deliver the big local programme.
Good morning, I'm Victoria Hills and I'm the Chief Executive of the Royal Town Planning Institute.
We have one of our guests joining us virtually who can hear us, but he can't see us. Just grateful if you could introduce yourself, please, Andrew.
Andrew Taylor, I'm Group Planning Director at Vistry.
Thank you. Planning and infrastructure. It's been in the news since the general election last year. It's a key area that's going to help us turbocharge and build the 1.5 million homes that the government have announced that they want to do. But we know that there are some issues and some bottlenecks within the planning system. Our questions this morning will be focused on that, and I just want to start by asking the members and witnesses in terms of the government's proposals around the national scheme of delegation. Is that something that you welcome, and what are your thoughts on that?
So I think there is certainly a world where which national scheme of delegations can work well to try and give some consistency and help speed up the process of planning in local authorities. I think the devil is going to be in the detail, and I think we would very much urge the government to move as fast as possible on the consultation with local authorities and other stakeholders about how that might be mapped out. In the original white paper, there was a consultation document. There was obviously a number of different options that were put forward about how this might work, and I think it's important to recognise that, you know, in a lot of places, most things are going through under delegated authority already. I think the average in London is about 98% of applications and things like that, and with only the sort of more extreme sort of strategically important schemes going to committee. And I think obviously what the government wants is consistency, so that when you're making an application and something is in alignment with the plan, that there's a strong likelihood that that will go through, because I think both local government and the government, you know, share a view of the importance of local plans. But I think the devil is ultimately there will be a lot of cases where, just because of the nature of reality, schemes won't 100% meet the plan in all aspects, and that's traditionally where the role of a local planning committee is, to try and assess the public benefit and make some of those trade-offs there. So I think we'd be looking to see a sort of core, a common core of a national scheme of delegations, the ability to flex to urban and rural environments, and also the ability for councils to go beyond the scheme of delegations. For example, if there is a thing that's on a rigid interpretation of the plan would be refused, but all common sense suggests that is in the public interest to go forward, the ability to move that to committee to be able to unblock it, for example.
Do you think there should still be an area where councillors retain some scrutiny capacity over maybe contentious applications, or where applications have received quite a lot of concerns from local residents?
I think that's you've got to have that ability in the system. I totally get the point about strengthening the importance of the local plan, making sure that there's greater consultation and buy-in in that, but then once that's in place, that gives greater certainty to applicants. Totally accept the principle behind that. I think it's understanding where there are those tensions between plan priorities that the local people have the ability to have their say, and local councils have the ability to try and adjudicate there. So support the principle of a common score of a scheme of delegation. Has got to work through the detail to iron out some of those practical challenges.
Victoria.
Thank you. Yes, the Royal Town Planning Institute broadly supports the principle of a national scheme of delegation. We know from our members, but we also know from the development community, one thing that they want is consistency. They also want clarity, but they also want competency. So we do think it's essential, if you're going to move to a national scheme of delegation, that you have a statutory chief planning officer in place who can be the right level of seniority, but also with the right professional competency. We would argue a chartered town planner professional would seem perfectly sensible to be that person, so that they can be so that they can hold the ring of that national scheme of delegation. It would be quite a change for some areas and no change at all for others. As the previous speaker just mentioned, you know, some councils delegate pretty much everything already, but others don't. And where the grey area comes in sometimes is on things like discharge of conditions, things that can really slow up the commencement of development. And being able to have someone who's professionally competent to be able to deal with some of those matters out with a committee seems perfectly sensible, whilst you have the appropriate levels of scrutiny through the local plan process upstream, then downstream you can leave the discharge of those conditions to a professionally competent planner. But really, to make it work, we will continue to make the case that you do need a statutory chief planning officer in every local authority to be the person to hold the ring on that national scheme of delegation. Thank you.
Madeleine,
So I suppose from our point of view, the important aspect here is neighbourhood planning and how the national scheme of delegation will interact with existing neighbourhood plans, but hopefully strengthen and support neighbourhood planning to be expanded to areas that don't currently have the capacity to do it. It's not that neighbourhood plans are perfect, and there are only about 1,500 of them in existence, mostly in wealthier areas with existing sort of civic infrastructure and social infrastructure to support them. But they are currently the only way, and the bill doesn't suggest any new ways, for communities at the hyper-local level to have an influence on planning decisions. By the time planning committees come around, it's really too late for most communities to have a genuine influence on making changes to planning decisions. They get to the point really where the only decision is, or the only option is block or not block. And communities that would like to see development go forward often find themselves kind of co-opted by the usual suspects into more extreme positions. If the national scheme of delegation could commit to expanding and strengthening neighbourhood plans so that more diverse communities can take part in them, to ensuring that a broader selection of groups could actually bring forward a neighbourhood plan beyond parish and town councils, which, again, typically aren't found in disadvantaged areas. And if we could ensure that neighbourhood plans were, once established, take precedence over other planning tiers, we think that a national scheme of delegation could work quite well.
Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies.
I'll bring you in, Andrew. Andrew Taylor.
Sorry, thank you, Chair. Sorry, Andrew Lewin. Thank you. Yes, I'm going to echo many of the comments. I think consistency across the country is really important. From our perspective, we need to know the process application is going to go through early on. I'm not going to disagree with the last comments that local engagement is really important, but actually we need to focus councillor time on the local plan and on the significant applications on their area, and then freeing up planning officers, as Victoria Hill's mentioned, to be able to delegate and deal with the smaller applications. I think there is importance in that consistency across the country, but also then in the committee processes that we follow after that. We have quite a lot of change at that level as well, so consistency across the board is very important. Thank you.
Thank you. You can never have too many Andrews. Apologies, Chair. Madeleine, I just wanted to briefly follow up on your answer, because I found that especially interesting, about how we engage more diverse communities in the process, because in my experience has been that people who are time poor, living busy lives, are less likely to get involved in a planning process, but actually, particularly if they are younger, it might have the greatest impact on them. So I'm really interested in your comments, and especially keen to know whether you've seen good examples of where, you know, broader sets of the community have got involved and what we could learn from that.
Absolutely. So it might be worth adding a tiny bit of context about Local Trust and what we do. We've set up to deliver the Big Local programme, which hands £1 million over to each of 150 communities to spend over 10 years on whatever their priorities are. And because those communities are chosen because they lack social infrastructure and sort of the usual suspects that I referenced before. A lot of those communities have chosen to spend some of that resource on developing the capacity to engage with decision making and planning. One really good example is Archer's Big Local in Chatham, who got together a neighbourhood forum and have put through a neighbourhood development order that prioritises good, sustainable homes as well as community social infrastructure. They've done a really great job. There are other examples like Lee Big Local, who really committed to planning for real as a way of engaging the community. It took over 2 years, but it produced great buy-in from the community in development going forward. I think it's also worth noting just some of the basics. So a lot of the communities that we work with are located in overspill estates on the edge of towns and cities. They have poor transport links and no real local news coverage. So it's important that information, decision-making proposals, everything be published both digitally but also through sort of direct mail to homes, because access to the internet for these communities is expensive and on phones. And I don't know if you've ever read planning documents on a phone, but it's really difficult to do and is a genuine barrier to access.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a follow-up question on that, because actually really interested to hear you reference Chatham and being the neighbouring constituency to me. I'm very, very aware, and in the same unity authority that I was a councillor in previously, I'm really aware of how that project worked, and it was really engaging and they did a lot of work around it, but it did take a lot of time. And that's the challenge, I think, that I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on if there are ways that the impact that has on timelines in terms of bringing development forward, and if there are ways that we could take some learnings from projects like that. Sorry, I'm just losing my voice. But not necessarily the same time scale. Yeah.
So the average neighbourhood plan takes about 30 months, I think, to develop. It's a long-term process, but it could well be a sort of gold standard if we roll it out properly across the country and support people to do it. It could also happen faster as a result. But in the meantime, yeah, there is a genuine lack of ways of engaging communities early on in a process that is fast enough to have a material impact on developments. And that's something we'd like to see this bill think about and include perhaps later down the line.
Just on that, Adam, obviously representing quite a big, diverse borough in the middle of London, you've a range of diverse constituents and residents, different groups. How do you think the National Scheme of Delegation will help give them the confidence that, you know, applications being taken by the council will adequately reflect some of their views and concerns? In London, you've got the additional challenge if you've got the layer of the mayor's office as well to deal with. Then you've also got national government.
So I think obviously we've got a well-established approach to delegations at the moment. I think obviously we'll have to see whether there'll be certain things that, you know, would historically have gone. There are still some areas which historically would have gone to committee when there is sort of notable local objection or whatever that triggers it going to committee. Whether that will be influenced in some way. But I think what's interesting, obviously, is that we have a network of neighbourhood plans, but there have been real differences in the amount of and how quickly some of those processes have developed, depending on the amount of social capital in those local communities. And as a council, obviously, we work to try and support communities that lack some of that social capital to do that through a range of sort of local grants and other support provided by the council. But it's interesting, obviously, in London you already have that multi-tier process where a neighbourhood plan has to be in alignment with the local plan, which then has to be in alignment with the London plan. Obviously, across the country we're now going to be adding an SDS process into all of that. So just in terms of that's a further challenge for neighbourhood planning, and particularly if local authorities, there's a big push nationally for local authorities to improve their neighbourhood plans, bring them forward, strengthen them up, add them into the SDS. That then means a whole other set of challenges at the grassroots level for neighbourhood planning, which will be, I'm sure, something Madeleine will have some fun with over the years to come.
Victoria.
Just a quick point on the engagement piece, if I may. One of the things we think is missing in the bill at the moment is the opportunity to also bring consistency for the digitisation of access to planning committees. There is a postcode lottery depending on where you live. Some local authorities, you can join committees down the line and participate as well as watch, but actually importantly participate in the planning committee in a digital way. and other places you can't. We do think it's somewhat strange if the department is investing a lot of time, effort and taxpayers' money in digitising the planning system to then have a digital system that cannot be accessed at the most important point, the decision point, digitally. So we would be keen to see that there is a statutory requirement for all planning committees to be able to be accessed digitally. Not only does this increase greater participation, it just opens up the conversation to a much broader range of people, and we ultimately think will help drive better outcomes.
Just go back to the point about diverse communities accessing these things. I think there is a job of work all council got to do to improve access and awareness of planning applications that are going forward. So obviously there's a digitalisation approach that trying to, and multi-channel approaches by the council rather than just putting stuff up on lampposts and a direct letter campaign. So, and there's more we can do learning from experience of diverse communities about how best to reach them.
Just finally for me, Victoria, obviously you mentioned the desire to see chief planning officers across every local authorities. I think the data reflects that there are only 23% of chief planning officers across local planning authorities. If we move to a system where we have one in every borough and we look at the national delegation scheme, bearing in mind some of the issues we've just highlighted here, do you think that if applications are approved and you see a big campaign or swell of opposition, could that cause concerns or even abuse and threats to chief planning officers?
Well, I think part of the reason we're advocating for a statutory chief planning officer is, we've got this very large bill here. This is a massive change programme on top of already overstretched local authority planning departments. We've had 25% of local authority planners leave local government in the last 7 years. And that's against a backdrop of halving of government department budgets in local government planning departments, I'm talking about the last 10 to 15 years. Introducing a massive change programme on top will not only put strain on the system, it will mean that you need to work in different ways, faster, smarter, more digitally enabled, as I've mentioned. To address your specific point there on I think harassment or being sort of it is a change that some decisions that used to go to a committee will now be going to a planner to decide, and that is why we think it's not just a nice to have, it's essential that that planner is not only professionally competent, i.e. chartered, they also have a statutory wraparound. As a statutory position, they then have a level of seniority in local government that provides that gravitas of opinion that is a professional opinion, a professional recommendation, a professional decision. Will it solve the bullying and harassment? Sadly, I don't think so, but will it help? Yes, I think it will do. It enables you to reset that relationship in local government. And let's face it, local government has limited powers to deliver their strategic vision, their ambitions. They have fiscal powers, they can raise a certain amount of tax locally. But their real tool to deliver their corporate vision, their corporate strategy, their only tool is the local plan. So you need a statutory officer to deliver that statutory document. And we think that that will go some way in redressing the balance that we now find ourselves in, where some of our members have to have police escorts out of meetings because the harassment's got so bad. We've got to move away from that. We have to change the conversation. Yes, we have to involve the public, but we also need to bring the right level of seniority back in and make planning great again in local government.
Great, thank you. Planning fees, Nashaba.
I was going to say, just following on from those comments, my questions are just a little bit about planning fees. Do you think that the recent increase in planning fees has allowed for an improved service from planning departments?
I think the recent increase in planning fees has been a welcome shot in the arm, but it's against that backdrop. So it's helping to plug some of the gap. Will it solve everything overnight? Absolutely not. What we're pleased to see in this bill is a ring fencing of fees, something we've been asking for many, many years. It's really good news, And it shouldn't be good news, it should be normal, but it's really good news that the money that applicants, developers, households, commercial business pay for the service is going to be spent on the service. That's really good news. But that only solves half of the planning system. That's the development control, the development management, the applications part of it. Got to remember the most important part comes back to the point I was just making on the local plan. And only 40% of local authorities have a local plan in place, an up-to-date local plan in place. That local plan is currently funded by local taxpayers. So as Madeleine said, it's quite right the local community want to get involved in it. They're paying for it. We think there was a missed opportunity in ring-fencing those fees, that we couldn't have some of the fees going towards paying for the business of the local plan. It's very expensive to produce, and local authorities have to think very carefully and strategically when they're doing it. So I think the missed opportunity in this fees enhancement, which is most welcome and much needed, is actually don't forget the local plan part of the process, and how can we get the development sector contributing to that, because ultimately it would benefit them as much as it benefits the community if a local plan is in place and it provides that clarity and consistency over what we want, where we want, and why we need it, what it's looking like, where it's going. That helps everybody. So I think we would urge the government to think again in how they can fund the business of the local plan.
Adam and Andrew Taylor.
So I think, obviously, we welcome the previous increase in fees, and we're obviously keen that moves forward again to help tackle some of that financial shortfalls, because, as has been said, you've had, I think between 2010 and 2021, a net decrease in spending on per person on planning dropped by about 59%. There's been a huge capacity withdrawal from local planning authorities, and it's not been something that people necessarily want to get into, I think. And we also have to be careful around some of the way in which the debate happens nationally around planning, that getting good planning is actually a great way to support the national objectives of growth and everything like that. We want planning to be something that a career that people want to go into, so we don't have capacity gaps. And I think there is a long-term programme between local government and the government to try and encourage more people into the sector. But that's got to be based on a consistent view about the future financial situation and it being a career that people want to get into. So it will take time to build back that capacity gap, particularly when a lot of people are being poached by the private sector from local council planning departments. So that is a real challenge as well. But we need more planners to be able to move things through the system quickly, particularly if we're moving to delegated authority. Because in terms of some of the pressures, it'll be when residents can be okay with decisions that don't go their way, provided they feel they've had a chance to have a say and that their views have been heard and listened to, and some of the points have been picked up. If planning officers are just overwhelmed by the throughput of information, particularly if local members have taken out the process, that will put greater pressure on individual planning officers. So I think it's, the fee stuff is really welcome, but we've got to sort of boost capacity overall to meet the government's objectives.
Okay. Andrew Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. First thing to say is we and most developers support the increase in planning fees to ensure we have a well-resourced local planning authority. I think that's a really important thing to get across. The consultation on increasing planning fees also talked about increasing performance, and I don't think we've yet seen that across the board. I will agree with Victoria Hills that this is a process and it's important to get the funding in to ensure we're continuing to improve, but actually we need to make sure that those improvements in service, which is not just about speed, the improvements in service are met and are delivered by local authorities. And then I think on ring fencing, it should be the whole planning service. You can't disaggregate development management from policy and enforcement element. You do need that. But I also think that the local council does have a responsibility on its future plan to actually put its financial resources behind the development of the local plan. It is determining the future of its area, and it's important that as a government sector that is financed as appropriately as part of that. Thank you.
Great. Michelle.
Thank you. I think in a lot of that, what I was going to pick up has been referenced, but I suppose it's just this, I guess, tension that I can see exist between what Victoria was saying, what Andrew's just said there. So we've obviously got a bit of a challenge in planning departments where they feel like they've been under-resourced, well, they have been under-resourced, you know, planning officers have left. The planning fees is part of that answer, and a potential way to help, but actually, it's, as you were suggesting, Victoria, that's not going to go far enough. It's not going to solve all the issues. But then the other side of that challenge is actually to unlock what we need to happen, move quickly, as Andrew said. We do need some sort of change in that space, so we need some timings, we need some time frames, and you said it's not just about time, it's other things as well. I mean, I've picked up some suggestions. Is there anything else that you think would help move this situation along? And just in terms of my understanding there of what the position is that correct? You know, that planning fees alone are not going to solve the challenges we've got in our planning departments.
I would add that there is a need for innovation in how to fund and finance capacity and capability in local government. And one of the greatest innovations that we have the profession's been the beneficiary of is the Level 7 apprenticeship, which the Charter Town Planner apprenticeship came in 2019. We now have over 60% of apprentices are in local government. It's been a huge success story. It's bringing in first generation of going to university. It's bringing in a diverse cohort into a profession and putting them on a professional pathway into a career, mostly in local government currently. We completely understand why the government wants to reform the apprenticeship levy and why there is an urgent need to tackle the needs. We completely accept that, but we are asking for a special deal, a dispensation for the government's 6th mission housing target. We need to keep the Charter Town Planner apprenticeship. The reason I'm raising it in answer to this question is because I haven't met a single chief planner in any local government department who will be able to afford to replace that Charter Town Planner apprentice if they can't access the Level 7 funding. And that means those several hundred apprentices that we currently have in local government will no longer be funded, and effectively it's turning a tap off. Of course we need to look to the future, what we've got there in seniority now to deal with applications, but we need to be bringing that pipeline in, as my colleague from local government here has said. And if we turn that tap off, we are taking one step forward with the fees and we've just taken 2 steps back again. And I can't make it any clearer than that. Thank you.
Thank you. No further questions.
Just mindful of time for our guests. We need to speed up on our responses. Joe.
Thanks, Chair. So I think spatial development strategies were already mentioned by Adam. Obviously, we've had spatial development strategies, but the bill intends to significantly increase the number. So I just, as an opening question, would like to hear your reflections on the role of spatial development strategies and what sort of time frame we might be looking at to get these in place across more of the country where needed, alongside, obviously in parallel, the local government reorganisation effort, where the two are obviously linked. So who wants to start on that?
I'm happy to, because we've been advocating for these for some time. The real beneficiary of having these documents is you can look at housing, you can look at environment, you can look at community, you can look at employment, industry, you can look at any thematic policy area you need to look at in an area that doesn't stop at a district or borough county boundary. And we know the importance of looking at infrastructure, particularly energy, water, nature, homes, is a very complicated and complex area, and you need to look at these things holistically. So we absolutely support the government's intention to move to a strategic plan-led approach. It can work and has been demonstrated to work. So
do you think it can speed up the delivery of housing?
We think it will speed up the delivery of housing, because what it does is it looks at the housing allocation in a much more pragmatic and spatially evidenced way beyond the smaller boundaries. So at the moment, we have examples where a housing target has been given to a council, I won't name them, and they can't deliver it because they haven't got the land available to deliver it, or the land is designated, they can't deliver it. And that is why you have 60% of local authorities sat there saying, can't do the local plan, we won't do the local plan, we can't find those homes. If you take the conversation out of the micro level or that district or borough level and you look at it holistically across an area and you take into account broader principles that could include nature, that could include infrastructure, and you look at housing through that lens, we believe that you can come up with a much more pragmatic and common sense approach, quite frankly, to where the homes need to go. That's been the missing part of the jigsaw puzzle that's got us into this situation. So we think it can do. Will it help overnight? Possibly not. But is it where we need to get to? Yes. We've been very clear that a public purpose of planning is about for the longer public good, and looking at things holistically is where we need to get to.
I'll come back to you, Andrew Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, SDSs are good. They need to be in place. You know, if we can do 12 months after they're brought in, that'd be really good. I am concerned for local government reorganisation and the impact that will have in terms of the process for these. Housing targets and distribution in the SDSs need to be mandatory. That need to be an important part of that process, and that will help to speed up then the delivery of local plans by the constituent councils after that. It would also be useful if SDSs can allocate a site, certainly strategic sites, and that would help to speed up that process and therefore to speed up the delivery of the housing as it goes through that process.
Madeleine.
We'd like to see the bill amended so that SDSs also have to mandate the distribution of social infrastructure in an area. Areas with higher density of social infrastructure have much better socioeconomic outcomes across the board, so whether that's employment, mental health, life expectancy. For this purpose, we define social infrastructure not as the current working paper on infrastructure puts it, so not prisons, schools and hospitals, but the physical community assets, places and spaces that communities gather, like pubs, community centres and playing fields, but also the community activity, the groups that animate these spaces, as well as connectivity, so transport and access, digital access, so broadband speeds, as well as networks. Social infrastructure is incredibly important for the success of new developments, but not just new developments. We think that spatial development strategies could be really important to redress the imbalance of social infrastructure in existing doubly disadvantaged neighbourhoods, doubly disadvantaged because they're both highly deprived materially but also lacking in crucial social infrastructure. So on the one hand dealing with the present but also preventing doubly disadvantaged developments of the future.
Adam.
So totally understand, obviously the government is trying to juggle a lot of balls and keep them in the air at the same time, doing LGR and Devo and this at the same time. Obviously we get the promised land is a world of, you know, a more unified set of local councils with, this is what the government's looking for, with a strategic level over the top of them, which will obviously help define the SESs. I think the key thing from a local authority perspective is to get buy-in for that, to get buy-in for the ability for a strategic level to ultimately impose certain things that you may not, that certain maybe certain local challenges, is to have some say in the shaping of that overall plan, so that the local authorities can feed into the strategic objectives of the wider area, make sure there's some trade-offs and quid pro quos, and actually making sure that there is benefit at the local level. So it's having that link between the local and the strategic, which is obviously the direction of travel for combined authorities that the government has set out in the current other bills that are going through Parliament. But I think the key thing is, yeah, local voice to influence and inform where strategic sites might be put, because local authorities may, you know, say they may moan and have some problems with stuff being imposed on them, but ultimately they will know in their local area where may be best for certain things to go, and it's having that as part of a broader discussion with the new strategic level. And we appreciate that some of the stuff in the bill is about how do you bridge that role with the Secretary of State and others until you've got those new structures in place. But I think the key thing is remembering that through the process, when we get there to long term, the local council voice has to be heard in the decision making of that overall strategic plan.
Thank you. Moving on. What have we got next? Back to you, Nishala. Development corporations.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So I suppose the question is just around whether we think there should be more mechanisms in place to ensure that there's a bit more democratic accountability of new development corporations, but also whether we think that these development corporations should be given those additional powers in order to lead on building houses alongside the private sector. I'd be interested to hear the panel's thoughts.
I mean, I can have a go at speaking to this one, and I will just declare an interest. I established the second Mayoral Development Corporation in 2015, but under different legislation. That was the Localism Act. And there is an important point there, that the powers still exist in that act. So there's plenty of powers there that elected mayors can use to establish development corporations. And it's within that lens that I'm answering the question that yes, it's perfectly reasonable to expect the community to be involved in it. Indeed, it's very sensible for anyone in the business of establishing a development corporation, but also bring forward development. Why wouldn't they want the community involved in some shape or form? Because they, of course, as we just heard from the councillor, they know what's going on in their local area and they know what's important, but most importantly, they know what they need. And I'll just share an anecdote. When we established the development corporation at Old Oak, we thought initially the most urgent need was for homes, but actually the community told us no, what they wanted was jobs for their children. And could we work on some employment creating activities early doors, and then the homes would come. So I can absolutely see the merits of involving the community, and I think we advocate that they should have appropriate representation. The way that the mayoral development corporations are set up currently on the Localism Act is there is opportunity for neighbourhood representatives to be on the board. So I see no reason why you wouldn't take a similar approach here. We found it very beneficial at Old Oak to have the community as part of the conversation. And they were that link back to the neighbourhood groups, plural. But actually, I would think it's commonly good practice for our members to be engaging with the community as part of those proposals coming forward. In answer to your question, should those development corporations be contributing directly to housing delivery? I mean, I think history's told us that they've done quite a big job of that in previous years. I know that there's some excellent research recently who pulled together the entire history of development corporations right back to the New Towns Act, and we can see some of the big developments were direct delivery. So I'm sure it will be for locally elected leaders to work out what good looks like for them, but I would envisage that we would see an element of direct delivery coming forward as well as a combination of other types of delivery, because the need is there for homes urgently. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to the time soon when the New Towns Commission report on what it is they're going to report on, where these locations are going to be. There will be an urgent need to get going on those. So we look forward to commenting on the detailed proposals. Yes, we would imagine there'll be an element of both community and direct delivery in both of them.
So I have to declare a related interest, which is that I chaired the Harsden Neighbourhood Forum, which did a lot of work on engaging with Old Oak Common, and as well as the Grand Union Alliance. And we at Local Trust feel strongly that there's a role here for paid community development workers, and that's something that a lot of development corporations already do. But we think it should be mandated and a prerequisite for engagement with the community, because without it, it's very difficult for communities to suddenly get together the capacity to engage properly.
Just very briefly, as we're all declaring interest now, obviously have some experience of a development corporation being created in a somewhat unusual manner for an unusual task. And I think the learnings from that experience and other things, I think, would encourage as early as possible engagement between the strategic authority and the local level to try and work out what the needs are and what the priorities are. And I think we would encourage there to be an adjudication route that could take place first before Secretary of State sign-off to try and iron out those schemes, because ultimately for these things to work well, it's when you've got buy-in from the local authorities, when you've got buy-in from the local communities through that process to make the things work as effectively as possible, but obviously recognise they have an important role to play and can play an important role in helping the government's delivery of 1.5 million new homes to break through some of those blockages, but it's got to be done in a way that engages with local stakeholders and values their input.
Thank you. Just coming on finally to bats and newts, environmental delivery plans. Will and Chris.
Thank you. The Prime Minister has said that the government will no longer accept the absurd spectacle of a £100 million bat tunnel. Will the bill prevent future infrastructure projects from being held up by what some consider a disproportionate environmental requirements? And then my second question is just on the cost of infrastructure, which is often linked to the UK's planning requirements. We tend to pay 8 times the cost of a similar infrastructure project in Europe, whether that be road or rail. Is this bill going to reduce that disparity in costs?
I can have a go first. I just on the road and rail, and it costs more. I think it has cost more in some circumstances, but it's not always been the case. So the high-speed one was delivered on time and on budget, and it's still within quite recent living memory that we were able to deliver those sorts of projects in that way. So I would just put that down as a marker that it can be done, and we need to get back to some business of that. I think that goes perhaps beyond the realms of this this bill. That comes to good project management, but more importantly, perhaps not going out to market and saying what something's going to cost before you launch it, and actually really being able, we've done it before, we can do it again. We need to get back to some of that greatness. In terms of disproportionate environmental requirements, I would say as a starting point, we don't recognise the word disproportionate, but we do recognise environmental requirements. And it is the case that there are lots of requirements on planning, and every time a new requirement comes up, it's been quite convenient to put it into the planning system. We're not averse to it going into the planning system as long as it's been resourced adequately to consider all of those impacts in an expedient way. So moving forward, the proposals to move to environmental delivery plans and for Natural England to be responsible for delivering those, we support the principle of it, but only on the caveat that they are appropriately resourced to be able to produce those delivery plans, but also, more importantly, to monitor them. Because what we've seen in very recent experience with the biodiversity net gain is a system introduced that hasn't been resourced and nobody's monitoring it. And it's no wonder the public is starting to lose some trust in whether or not any biodiversity net gain is being consistently delivered. And so moving towards an environmental delivery plans, again, if we're going to fundamentally change the way that that's being dealt with, not at a local level, it's going to a national agency and they're going to look at it strategically. We support the principle of looking at it holistically because we know nature doesn't stop at district boundaries. We're not against the principle of it, but what we are against of is can we not have another biodiversity net gain where something's been set up, it's not being adequately resourced and nobody's monitoring it. And those aren't my words, that's the National Audit Office report last May has said that about biodiversity net gain. So we've seen what happens when something is established in that way. We want environmental delivery plans to work, everybody wants them to work, but Natural England are going to need some serious resourcing for them to be able to work. So that is something that we'll need a close eye on it. We look forward to working with Natural England on it, declare an interest. We've got members working in Natural England. They are perfectly capable of getting this working if they're resourced to do so. Thank you.
I think we support the government's approach to trying to be more strategic about how we deal with nature. So understanding that the best way to spend £100 million on bats probably isn't your tunnel there. It's how to strengthen and improve the natural environment elsewhere that can create a better habitat. And I think the overall approach is to be welcomed. I think just in terms of the minutiae of it, at the moment the suggestion is that the consultation window for EDPs will be 28 days. We think that is possibly a bit tight to get the right level of input in there. So I think that if we can look at being a bit more flexible on that without kicking, what you don't want to do is just kick the can forever down the road, but just to get the right level of information together, 28 days is a bit of a tight time.
We can't kick the bats, Adam. Andrew Taylor.
Thank you. Yes, environmental delivery plans are really sensible. They build on the good work local nature recovery strategies are starting to do at a local authority level, taking it up into a broader geographic scale. It's much more sensible to look at bringing nature back to the level it needs to be at on a landscape level, on a catchment area level, and dealing with these issues that are stopping development now, such as the nutrient issues. Delivering those at a catchment area is much more sensible than the piecemeal approach we have at the moment, which is very cumbersome. But it is not a development versus nature issue, and there's too much of that rhetoric at the moment, unfortunately. These two things can coexist, whether it's housing, whether it's infrastructure and nature. And I do think that EDPs are a good balance between that and being able to develop that broader strategy that Natural England will be doing. I echo the other comments. Natural England needs to be resourced to be able to deliver these as quickly as possible next year to be able to ensure that we can make use of this sensible approach.
Only to say that blue and green spaces are often the only shared space that communities have. They're an important form of social infrastructure, and although we don't necessarily disagree with any of the other panellists on this, we do know that communities have spent a lot of time restoring and undoing damage done to their green and blue spaces, and it would be really important from a growth perspective that we don't find ourselves making those mistakes again. Okay. The cost of health alone in doubly disadvantaged neighbourhoods to the public purse is 29 billion annually. So given the health and well-being impact of green and blue spaces and local wildlife places, we have to take that into consideration.
No, for sure. Chris?
I think Andrew's point's really important there, right? Like, what's most offensive about the current system is not just that it blocks development, but that we've become one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. So it's failing completely on its own terms. So I think actually getting this bit right is probably the most important. Because I can't turn around to my constituents and justify the offensive waste of money that's being spent on projects that aren't really helping nature at all under the current system. So getting this right needs to be one of the most important bits of the bill. And I'm quite conscious at the moment about the number of people who seem to be not particularly confident that it's going to work. If you see, particularly for national infrastructure projects, coming back to the Bat Tunnel question, Catherine Howard's written that planning lawyer that it probably won't particularly work. So, I mean, sort of slightly reframe Will's question. If this law had been passed 3-4 years ago, do you think the Bat Tunnel would have still have been built?
Oh, who wants to answer that one?
You can put a percentage chance on it if you...
I think it would help reduce the likelihood of it, because if you're able to behave strategically and think where is the best place for that in this particular part of the world, you can make some of those trade-offs in a more sensible manner. I do take the point that Madeleine made. I live very close to the Westway, that sort of drove a massive infrastructure thing right through the middle of town, and we and there's there's always impacts of things that are done at pace without the right level of local consultation. So I think what we're trying to do is streamline some of those things up front, so you can be aware of the challenges, work out how to mitigate them, rather than it being a blocker and you having to do your bat tunnels.
And I would say that the point here about these environmental plans is they take the principle of a strategic approach, looking at things strategically. And I'd support the point just made that being able to look at whether you can do something else alternatively to creating that structure, and it may be the case that was the only solution for those bats, but it may be that there was another solution, but it may be that because that wasn't part of the considerations and it was just a very linear approach and it wasn't looked strategically, that's where the answer came. I think it's rather unfortunate, not least for the bats, but for the broader conversation, that this tunnel has become, if you like, the poster boy or the poster animal of this discussion. because we are possibly in danger of losing the point here that there is a real opportunity with the bill to do it better, as you say, and we need to ensure that it's resourced to do it better. In looking at things strategically, if different agencies, different people had been a part of that conversation, it's highly likely there may have been a number of different options on the table apart from one particular tunnel. But we'll never know, because that time's gone now and it's moved on.
But the problem is, right, there's a difference between looking at things strategically and achieving things strategically, right? And I get that, the bill is introducing a way of looking at things strategically, but, you're still applying the precautionary principle to EDPs, which is, when you've got an organisation like Natural England, has traditionally behaved quite risk averse, the bar that they're going to have to jump over in order to clear an EDP, I think, is arguably still going to be quite high. There's no real pressure and incentive, I think many would argue, on them to do so because there's no other workaround. And it's basically put into the legislation, primary legislation, that if this doesn't work, or doesn't end up achieving the things that we hope, either through lack of resourcing, because that precautionary principle still applies, because a whole range of other issues. It's very little we can do about this later, which is again why I think it's really important to get it right. So, do you think there's something that we could be looking at this stage? None of you seem particularly. You can't say that. I get that you can't say that the bat tunnel would be built. None of you seem to be fairly confident in saying that it would have stopped the bat tunnel being built, which the Prime Minister said multiple times we need to achieve. So, is there anything that you think we could be doing in this legislation to increase confidence that would be able to stop the bat tunnels or similar projects in the future?
So on national infrastructure, obviously there is a clear steer that does empower the Secretary of State and central government. So I think that's there, and obviously on the pre-application stuff, there's a whole range of things that are designed to speed things up, and you do get a sense that more tools are being given to central government for those things that are naturally strategic. And I'm sure the government will continue in that vein if it finds it's not making progress. But I think, these certainly, again, we can't. No one can sit here and give absolute confidence on this, but the direction of travel is fairly clear.
Yes, we just to be clear, I'm not allowed to comment on specific proposals because it's our members who are ultimately involved in giving the consent for those schemes. But what I would say is, we support, we support looking at these things holistically. You started your statement by saying, most nature depleted, so we've got to look at these things seriously, and we have to take the right amount of time to look at them. Sometimes taking the right amount of time to look at them may be frustrating, and some of the comments you referenced, they're political comments, and that's fine. Elected politicians are elected and they can make those comments. But the professionals need to have the right amount of time to look at these things and come up with the right solutions. And as I said about the bat tunnel, that may have been the only solution. There may have been other solutions on the table. But in a new, looking at things strategically, environment, perhaps with we talked about local government reorganisation, a local mayor involved, they may have looked at it and said, actually, could we look at this a bit more pragmatically? Does that particular piece of infrastructure need to be built in that way, in that place, or could we do things differently? So we do think the new strategic approach coming in provides the opportunity to have those conversations differently, but I don't think any of us are prepared to sit here and say the bat tunnel would or wouldn't happen. And we'll leave it at that. I can't even say it with a straight face, Chris.
But part of this is also about how Natural England works and to what extent, how that's governed, what it's how its priorities are tweaked, what role its Secretary of State has in terms of managing some of those priorities. So that's possibly beyond the scope of this particular discussion.
Thank you. I think we will safely discuss the bats and newts on another occasion. Just to thank everyone for attending this session this morning, and you've given us some really important points and areas that we will develop further as we see the bill progressing. Can we switch over guests, please? Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Taylor. Morning. Can I just ask our guests to introduce themselves for Hansard, please?
Catriona Riddell. I'm an independent consultant, and I work mainly with local planning authorities, but have spent a lot of time on strategic planning in various guises, and I currently chair a national strategic planning group which has been looking at how the new system of spatial development strategies could work.
Thank you.
My name is Chris Young. I'm King's Counsel. I'm a barrister, and I work for developers, local authorities and third parties, usually at appeal or examinations in public, sort of sharp end of decision making.
Thank you, Chris.
Good morning, I'm Matthew Spry. I'm a Senior Director at Lichfields, one of the country's largest planning and development consultancies.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. We're going to start, if we can, with planning committees. So the government sort of has a stated objective of finding a balance between promoting sustainable development and protecting local decision making. I'm interested in the views of the panel, perhaps starting with you, Matthew, on what a national scheme of delegation might look like, and if there are any particular functions that you think should be delegated to planning officers.
Thank you. I mean, I think the sort of starting point to think about with this is that this proposal will have an impact, but it will be small in the short term, because most of the proposals that were discussed in the working paper revolve around projects that are or are not in accordance with the local plan. And because we've got such low coverage of up-to-date local plans at the moment, most major proposals, and by major we mean projects of over 10 homes, won't be in accordance with the development plan. And so even under these proposals, it is highly likely that the majority of major schemes will still go to planning committees, and therefore elected members will be making judgments over those schemes. Over time, the principle is to avoid double handling of decisions, so you want more of those decisions made upstream through local plans and through the setting of clear policies, and then provided proposals come forward comply with those policies, there should in theory be no need to look at them again, no need to then look at reserved matters again, and no need to look at the discharge of conditions. So that's the sort of end game. The working paper put forward options for how you do that, what a scheme of delegation looks like. I think logic does take you to a scheme focused on compliance with the development plan, but it will require care, because within the planning system, what ought to be a sort of binary decision often isn't. It's a judgment that balances different development plan policies pull in different directions, so you have to arrive at a conclusion about compliance with the development plan as a whole. And planning officers need to do that in determining or recommending on applications anyway. They'll also be doing that to determine whether or not it should go to committee. So you need to make sure there's no sort of cross infection, if you like, of those two sort of exercises that are being carried out. We also need to avoid a perverse incentive for local authorities not to prepare local plans if they think it disempowers them from making decisions on the big applications in their area. So whatever is in the scheme of delegation does need to be accompanied by a very strong shift towards ensuring that local plans are in place, so that the balance of elected member input is going into that process rather than on individual applications. The final thing to say on this is with the Levelling Up Regeneration Act, there will in turn be national development management policies taking on the role that is currently formed by policies in development plans. So there'll be a need to future-proof any scheme of delegation to deal with compliance with NDMPs as well as with local plan policies.
Thank you very much. There's lots there. One point in particular, keen to follow up on. You said that the principle was about avoiding sort of double handling. It's one that I think I would endorse, and I think it's important if there's a sense that we need to get things moving through the system, but it might not be a view that's universally taken. Do you think the principle of avoiding double handling is right?
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely. It's the way most countries organise their planning systems.
Great, excellent. Thank you. I think this part of the bill is going to get sort of a lot of attention. I'm interested in the views, again, Matthew, but also the whole panel, of if the bill should go further in setting out the details you believe at this stage, rather than it being subject to future regulation?
I suspect it's possibly not helpful to set out lots of detail, because these things are quite difficult to get right, quite frankly. So you want the ability to flex and take account of unintended consequences without having to go back to the primary legislation to do it. So in my view, it makes sense to do it through regulations, but obviously those need to come forward quickly.
Great, thank you. That's all.
Thank you. Moving on to Will. Oh, my apologies, Nashab, planning fees.
Thank you. So I picked this up with the previous panel, but I just wanted to get your thoughts from this panel on around planning fees. How prescriptive is the bill's ring fence on planning fees?
Yeah, so the ring fencing is provided in a provision which says that, in effect, the fees have got to be focused on the functions. So it's 8C in terms of the technical addition at clause 44, and it says the local planning authority must secure that their income from fees or charges paid in pursuance of the regulations is applied towards the carrying out of the functions that the authority has. But those functions are defined specifically in relation to determining planning applications and also certificates of lawfulness. What it doesn't do is fund local plan making, which, as you've heard from earlier speakers, comes from council tax, basically. And there is an argument to say that really, if we're going to have a plan-led system, you should have a focus on funding the plans properly. The government has injected a whole load of money recently in funding the plans, and then really, in relation to the last issue, once the members have done what they should do, which is make the difficult decisions about allocating sites, you should leave it to the professional officers to determine the applications, and I don't think the detail needs to be in the regulations. And the reason for that is we don't democratise everything we do. The NHS spends huge amounts of money, makes decisions based on professional judgments. The judgments about the applications are often best made by the professional officers themselves and all the statutory consultees that advise them. But if I could just in terms of what the fee is doing, what this is seeking to do is introduce more ability for local authorities to set their own fees. And I think that's fine, provided the provision in the bill, which is set out at 8B, makes clear that the local authority will have to ensure that the fees that they're charging do not exceed the cost of carrying out the function. Now, if that is in relation to the carrying out of the function of determining planning applications, that money isn't available for local plans, and that's how it stands at the moment. So that's something to consider, whether some of that money should relate to local plans, because ultimately a lot less time needs to be spent on planning applications if there's an allocation, particularly if you couple that with delegation and say, well, actually, once the site is allocated, you don't need the members to redetermine it, and you certainly don't need them to determine the reserved matters. I did an appeal recently, where there are 20 reasons for refusal on an allocated site with outline planning permission, and not one of them stood up at appeal. There's some really dubious decisions taken to effectively determine planning applications unrelated to, if you like, professional planning advice and national policy. But can I just make one point? Do developers want a better service? Yes, they absolutely do. The service at the moment is not adequate. It's very, very slow, very cumbersome, and that is delaying and will delay the 1.5 million that the government wants to achieve. Are developers willing to pay for a better service? Yes, they are, provided the fee increase results in that. The biggest problem is the lack of planners. As things hot up, as we see more applications going in for large sites on grey belt and green belt, that means the developers are going to want more professional planners. They're going to go to the planning consultancies to get more staff. The planning consultancies are then going to pay people from the local authorities to fill their positions. And so what you really need is government funding of planning schools, that's postgraduate and undergraduate courses, on a much bigger scale to deliver lots more planners. And then final point, The fees, and I think the government has looked at this in the amendments, the fees need to cover the statutory consultees. So a big, massive break on the system at the moment is how long it's taking with Natural England, the Environment Agency. They're taking ages to respond. They don't see any of the fees. So there needs to be a total assessment of the cost of the process and included. And that's what this is seeking to do. It's seeking to let authorities look at the total cost. It does vary in different areas. It varies if you've got a lot of ecological constraints, which they have in parts of Sussex, for example, and allow them to look at the total cost, including the statutory consultees, and then set the fees according to that. At the moment, we have planning performance agreements, which are unregulated. They can be huge sums of money just for one meeting, £10,000 for a single meeting with the Mayor's office online. And that needs to be regulated. The legislation doesn't do that yet. So a similar control in relation to regulating planning performance agreement fees tied to the nature of the work that's being done.
Just a follow-up question. I'm sure you would have seen some of these reports about the building safety regulator and their impact on signing off buildings, particularly in London where you've got more high-rise buildings.
Yeah.
Do you think this fee recovery suggestion that you're making could help staff and speed up the BSR?
I don't have any expertise in terms of building regulations, so it's important to say that. I don't know what the fees are charged in relation to that. I do know there's a problem. But I think the problem is, again, a lack of staff. So fee increases. In planning, for example, there's been 2 rounds of fee increases in the last 6 months, at the end of last year, and then a bumper addition in the last year. One of your questions is, will that improve the service, or has that improved the service? It's too early to say whether those increases will. But I spoke to a head of planning this morning who was telling me it's all very well having more fees, but if I haven't got the staff, I can't provide the service. This is going to take a number of years to work through, and in particular, what we desperately need is a lot more planners.
Yeah, the National Federation of Builders have raised concerns about the issue of localised fees increasing, and they've touched on the point that the fees have increased twice in the last 5 years with no service improvement. Another suggestion is obviously around training for elected members on planning committees. Do you think that's another area that would help?
Yeah, I'll just answer that briefly. Yes, absolutely, to increase the amount of training, no question. You know, I've got 100,000 hours in planning at the front end, and I'm still learning all the time. It's an incredibly complicated system, and that's why really it's best trusted to the planners. That's why delegation. I mean, people say 98% of decisions are already delegated,
Yeah, exactly.
but the fact is that that's household extensions. We're talking about the major applications that Matthew's talking 10 or more. Some of the ones I deal with, I'm in inquiry at the moment. It's 8,000 houses. Angela Rayner has called that in as the Secretary of State. You know, that should be an issue, at least as far as the recommendation is concerned, determined by officers initially and then members. But there's a lot of schemes for 100, 200 homes which would be perfectly capable of being subject to delegated authority. As with the master builders, they particularly represent the small and medium-sized sector, and that is much more of an issue for them, and there needs to be looked at graduated fees. When you're developing a greenfield site for 1,000 homes, the gross development value is in the billions. So, you know, the fee increase is not a significant issue. But if you're a small builder doing 5 houses, these fee increases are significant. So that's why I agree, you know, really, a lot of this shouldn't be in the legislation. It needs to be researched further and then put into secondary legislation.
Catriona.
Yeah, I've just got a couple of points really to make about this in terms of, it's all linked in terms of scheme of delegation, member training and the planning fees. I mean, we work in a planning system and all of this is focusing on the downstream bit. We are trying to get a plan-led system working, so we need, as I think as Chris said, we've got to try and find a way of resourcing the upstream bit, the local plan bit. When I work with a lot of local planning authorities, the policy teams, those responsible for preparing local plans, are tiny. Quite often they're lucky if they've got 2 or 3, because local authorities are measured, their success is measured on speed of how they deal with applications, their housing delivery test, all the things that they get tested on and measured on is at the application stage. So inevitably, all the funding goes into development management. And as Chris said, we haven't got an awful lot of planners to go around. So the priority is always given downstream to the development management side of things. So if we are going to have a plan-led system, and there's a lot in this that will help that, but specifically in terms of fees, I think we need to try and find a way of making sure if it's ring-fenced for the planning service. I would ask also, maybe there's a question there about how easy it is to ring-fence funding specifically for part of a service, and that's a very specific question. But the other point I would make is around future-proofing this in the future. If we are going to have universal coverage of mayoral strategic authorities and they are going to have development management powers, we need to think about that in the context of both the national scheme of delegation but also in terms of the planning fees. And then in terms of member training, we have to get member training right across the board. It's not just about making decisions on planning applications. It's my same point. We need members trained on how to deal with a planning application. What is the purpose of planning? And actually, that's probably a whole council role. So I don't think member training should be exclusively for those that actually sit on a planning committee. And there's also, just to make the point, that there are different planning committees. You touched on development corporations earlier. National parks have a very different composition as well. They've got elected members, they've got parish members, but they've also got members directly appointed by the Secretary of State. So they are a very different composition. And we will have more development corporations, likely to have more development corporations. So there's different makeups of committees that we need to take into account. So I think the whole bill needs to be future-proofed in terms of local government restructuring and the devolution aspects that will come forward in the English Devolution Bill.
Okay, thank you.
I want to briefly touch on CPO compulsory purchase issues. Is it possible that in some cases landowners could be offered less than the price they originally paid for the land if hope value is disregarded?
Yes, in a word.
I think the chairman loved the answer because I know we're a bit short of time. That's really helpful. What impact do you think that would have? And then can we have safeguards, or what safeguards could be in place to stop CPO powers being abused?
I mean, this isn't really in this Act, actually, in this bill. It was in the LURA, in the Levelling Up Bill. It was the previous government's idea to remove hope value, and I think they just misunderstood what it is, to be honest. I've spoken to various practitioners who specialise in compulsory purchase, and they've told me the mistake the government made and the Secretary of State, Lord Gove, made was he seemed to think that hope value was something in addition to market value. It isn't. Hope value is the increase from agricultural land value, £12,000, £20,000 an acre, if that land is on the edge of a town. But it's its market value. So it's encouraging the government. This government has not continued to pursue this point with any great rigour, because the difficulty is you'll see landowners extremely reluctant to release their land if they're compulsory purchased at agricultural land values, knowing they could achieve a different figure. They simply won't allow the land to go that route. CPO, 2 or 3 years. Legal challenges. Anybody who has their land compulsory purchased for less than, or for the agricultural land value, will pursue that to the Supreme Court, because you're fundamentally taking away the value of somebody's land. So this whole area has largely been parked, and quite rightly so, because it's a misunderstanding of CPO powers and a misunderstanding of value.
Could I just, if it's okay, just to come in on at this point? I think the local planning system relies every year on evidence from landowners and paid for by landowners and developers on the evidence that the sites that are potentially to be allocated or granted permission are deliverable and suitable and so on. And that's essentially paid for by a form of hope value. It's paid for by the expectation that if permission is granted, the value increases, and that's the basis on which the site's allocated. So if you remove willing landowners from the equation at the outset of the process because of a fear of CPO on a widespread scale, then you risk not enough land being advanced through the system in the first place, because a lot of the legwork is done by landowners contributing to call for sites processes and local plan processes and so on.
Yeah. Chris?
Just jumping very briefly on this point, 'cause I'm just slightly lost on the logic. I mean, okay, so look, we know particularly at the moment that land is often, let's say, overpaid for by developers, right? In the sense of compared to what the local authority may want to extract from the land value through S106, they'll later come back later and say, particularly in what we've just been through in recent years where inflation's gone out of control, we can no longer pay for it. And really what they're saying there is we overpaid for the land 3, 4, 5 years ago compared to what's deliverable now, right? So, I don't think it's undesirable to get land values down for development, given the consequences of that are increasing the amount that we can get built, affordable housing, etc. I mean, I get your point on not coming forward, but surely actually, like in most cases, the CPO powers are rarely going to be used. But having that leverage, the potential for that to happen, surely that's going to push landowners in some of these places, incentivise them to actually come to a deal to release that land in a way that's appropriate at a fairer price, because they know that there's that lever behind them that could be used if they didn't.
Yeah, I mean, Chris will have a comment on this, but I think in theory, yes, but the key thing is about the sites being promoted in the first place, but mainly by promoters who take essentially work on the basis that they take a share of the uplift in land value once permission is granted. And that's the basis on which they effectively invest in paying for the sort of feasibility work to take through the planning system. And I agree, if it's a rare intervention in very unusual circumstances, then there ought to be confidence to kind of move forward on that basis. But if it becomes more of a widespread threat, and I guess the issue is particularly for more marginal schemes, because if schemes are straightforwardly deliverable, then they'll come forward. Where schemes get stuck is when there is some sort of issue that arises around infrastructure or the viability is sort of crunched. And that's where there is potentially more of a kind of standoff in terms of delivery. And I guess the question is, if the threat of CPO existing use value is less, is more likely, then those more marginal, more difficult sites may be less likely to come forward.
I think what I'd say is, the system works, so don't try and fix it. It works really well, and huge amounts of money are extracted out of the increase in land value, billions.
I don't think it's about increasing the amount of money that's extracted necessarily. It's about stopping what we've got now, which is housing in this country just completely stopping, because all projects have suddenly stopped becoming viable, because the way we extract land value in this country is not very far from being ideal.
Yeah.
In a situation where you can have a situation we're currently in. So it's about trying to think about how that's done better. It feels like that CPO lever, that leverage, could be one of the ways of solving that problem.
But I suppose if you have the threat of saying, well, take your land at agricultural land values, then that is a lever. I can't deny that. But in truth, what happens is it varies from cities. And if you think about the government's new grey belt policy, the condition there is 50% affordable housing. That comes off the land value. So the landowners are now all adjusting, and applications are being submitted with a very significant reduction. Bear in mind, there's also huge road transport infrastructure costs to be paid for, ecological benefits. I mean, you can only make it work so hard, but certainly land values in those areas, Greenbelt, are lower because there's a much higher level of house prices, but they can afford the 50%. If you do development schemes in urban areas and they're tall buildings, most of them can't afford the affordable housing. It just doesn't work because they're so expensive to build. So regeneration, great. I don't think all schemes have stopped. What's happened is the registered providers have been told to focus, particularly by the previous government, on the existing stock and improving their stock. And I'm not saying that isn't a legitimate issue, but they're now not going to the market and agreeing to do Section 106 schemes. They don't want to take on board Section 106 schemes. And if that happens, the greenfield sites don't come forward, and it's the greenfield sites that deliver the affordable housing at scale. Social housing delivery in this country has absolutely collapsed, and that's because of the focus on brownfield sites. I'm not against regeneration, but recognise it's all those grey belt sites and green belt sites which will deliver the affordable housing at scale.
Could I just add, I mean, I take a slightly different view on this. I've worked in the system since 1990. Before 2010, 2008, 9, viability wasn't an issue because it was a planning-led development world where the plan dictated where the development would go. We didn't have call for sites, things like that. Viability didn't exist. Viability was introduced into the system post the global crash in 2008 because a lot of landowners, particularly in the southeast, had overpaid for the land, and it was to try and get the house building system going again, and it has stayed with us. I think compulsory purchase, again, local authorities have been they are generally very risk adverse, so they don't use it. So I think anything that begins to start rebuilding a plan-led system and actually getting development built in the right places as opposed to where developers want to build them. Hopefully it's the same thing, but it isn't always. Then I think we need to start thinking about what these levers are and how we can use them more effectively. And I do think that there is an awful lot being asked of the planning system, and I think in terms of affordable housing that is absolutely the case, and there is planning system is increasingly having to do an awful lot of the heavy lifting around biodiversity and everything else. All of it's good, but it is creaking in terms of what you get out of that. Somebody said to me the other day, have you ever looked through the major house builders' profit books, the profit margins that they make? I don't genuinely believe that for some of these large house builders that viability is an issue, if I'm honest, especially in the southern half of the country and around the cities where they make most of their profits. And it may be a slightly different view from my colleagues, but
I think a different view on the panel as well. Just on your theme of biodiversity, I know that obviously the panel do not have expertise in environmental delivery plans, but I think Chris had a question to you all on that.
Yeah, more, I don't know if you watched the previous panel, but it's more sort of coming in, potentially start with you, Chris, on the point there. I speak to many people, you've seen what Catherine Howard's written, particularly when it comes to large national infrastructure projects. Spoken to other planning lawyers as well. There is a real feeling among many that these things. I spoke to one yesterday who said he expects, if he was to guess, he'd expect one of these to be put in place by 2029. So, I suppose your view on how likely these are to be able to be rolled out efficiently and effectively, and what, and if there is some worry about that, what we can do to ensure that they are.
Okay, so I think they should be welcomed.
Yeah.
I think that they are very clearly capable of overcoming some significant problems. So you probably all heard about nutrient neutrality. It's a major issue. It's stopping house building, and having a joined-up approach to addressing that issue in a comprehensive way is undoubtedly the right solution. There's no question about that. I mean, there is a question about, you were talking about the extent to which nature depletion has taken place in this country, and this suggestion that we're one of the worst in the world in terms of our nature. You've got to look, when it comes to nutrients and other issues, at the agricultural sector. The agricultural sector overwhelmingly contributes to the nutrient problem, but with the greatest respect, parliamentarians are not quick to front up to the agricultural sector. They are the main polluters, and that is where the problem is. House building is a tiny proportion of the nutrient problem, and yet it's stopped hundreds of thousands of houses being built. So this solution, which I know has been looked at for a long time, is a very pragmatic and sensible approach. The petition by 34 leading charities and organisations raising concern about this, I think, is more focused on individual species protection. And you've obviously going to listen and take account of that. But again, a comprehensive approach. Biodiversity net gain can be dealt with, for example, on site. Just take a different topic. But in some areas, Buckingham, for example, they have environmental enhancement zones or biodiversity enhancement zones. And to focus on a particular area in a comprehensive and joined-up way is very, very sensible. But your question is about the timescale. This is going to take an awful lot of work by Natural England, and they're going to need the funding to do this, and we don't have all the detail. I think they're a good idea. I think the secondary legislation and policy and guidance is where we're going to see the detail of that. And I think also you're concerned about legal challenges. Yes, there is the risk of legal challenges at various stages through that process if you look at all the provisions, and what might be sensible to introduce what exists for local plans which is called a preclusive provision, which means that there won't be a legal challenge until the point at which it's adopted, and you stop constant legal challenges, because there will be lots of legal challenges. And one final, comfort to you is that until these are in place, the existing system will have to continue until there are these.
That's not a comfort. I mean.
Yeah, but the existing system does spend a lot of time and energy. You've got the BAT tunnel example, focusing on ecology. Ecology is by far the most significant issue looked at in planning applications now, but site-specific solutions are not always the answer.
Yeah, sorry, I completely agree on that. I'm completely sold on the need for the changes, completely sold on the EDPs. Okay. My worry is purely that this isn't going to stop the back tunnels or equivalents or EBS fleet, whatever we're looking at, getting built, and just ensure, the consequences of not getting this right, I think, are quite severe in terms of building the number of homes, being able to deal with climate change. We haven't built a reservoir in decades. We've become awful at building big national infrastructure projects as a country, and the consequences of not fixing that are pretty severe. And this feels like one of the big blockers in order to make sure that we can. And I just want to be reassured that in the primary legislation in this bill, we are going far enough. And if you've got any ideas for places we should be going further on this,
just on Chris's point, do you feel that Natural England is adequately resourced in terms of working with a range of different third parties they're going to have to consult and liaise with? So you've got, your farmers, your habitat banks, environmental NGOs, to make sure that they bring forward, a quite concrete and good EDP plan.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very valid question, and the answer is simply no. So ecology has become a massive issue, some would say a massive industry, all the reports that are produced in relation to it. My sister is a planning officer. She looks at all these reports and says she's perhaps gone into the wrong profession. Perhaps she should have become an ecologist, because there seems to be a boundless amount of work on this. It's all for the good, but it is extremely expensive, very, very difficult for small and medium-sized builders. You have to have reports on everything, on bats, on newts, and flora and fauna and everything. It's very, very regulated, and I think it is slowing down development. It's creating a huge amount of delay. Proper resourcing of Natural England, I think, is absolutely fundamental, and I think the levy and what's proposed here is a way of doing that, because the costs of managing it will be included in the costs of running it, and developers are willing to pay significant amounts of money to deal with ecology and to make sure that there is a biodiversity net gain and there's proper ecological protection. And I think a more coordinated approach with a properly funded Natural England is absolutely the right answer. But they're not properly funded now, and there are, they're really committed officers, but there's only so much they can do. And actually, every local authority, going back to the fees, this is all linked. Does that mean there's a vote?
No, it just means we need to speed up a bit.
Okay. All I would say is that, local authorities actually need to have a lot more specialist staff. They need ecologists, they need other people, and that's why the fees are probably crucial to all of this.
Just on that point as well, I know we're coming on to strategic planning and spatial development strategies, but that was a critical role in the past of regional strategies. I was Director of Planning for the South East Regional Assembly, and one of the things we worked really closely with all the government agencies on, Environment Agency, Natural England, was to address some of this. So two really important examples. We had 2 water reservoirs proposed in the South East Plan. Obviously never happened because the South East Plan disappeared, but we worked really close with Environment Agency and all the local authorities, looking well in advance about where we were going to be dealing with water shortages. Horsham fell by the wayside last week in terms of their local plan. One of the reservoirs was to sort out that whole Sussex area. The other thing we had in the South East Plan, and it was a policy that survived, is around the Thames Basin heaths. Again, we worked across parts of Surrey, Hampshire and Berkshire to make sure that the heaths were managed within the whole approach to growth and to housing. So strategic planning is the answer to a lot of this.
Thank you. Joe, Esther.
Well, just building on that, if anyone else has any thoughts on the use of spatial development strategies, and Catriona, on those, I'd be just good to, you've brought up an example and then said that obviously that it didn't realise what you'd hoped it would happen. So why did that?
Because the plan was abolished.
Yeah. So I guess my question then is, How do we prevent that happening in the future? There's obviously going to be a role for mayors. That's another layer of politics. We heard in the previous panel some of those issues about different levels. How do we actually make I think we would all agree these plans, strategic planning is a good idea. How do we ensure it delivers the intent that you had when you were drafting that plan?
Yeah, I mean, regional strategies was sort of a little bit of a blip. We had structure plans for decades before that, and they survived. And you know, it was maybe political ideology rather than the fact that it didn't work that abolished it. But nonetheless, I think, you know, I was involved in some research last year which looked at the last 14 years in strategic planning, and there was overwhelming support in the survey work that we did with stakeholders and local authorities around having something that was mandatory, universally applied, and had robust governance structures, because a lot of what we were talking about was risk. It was about technical risk, it was about political risk, and it was about financial risk. So what we're seeing in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill now is to help reduce the risks. But strategic planning, fundamentally, I call it the ringmaster. It's a spatial investment framework. Whatever model you use, it is a spatial investment framework, and it acts as that ringmaster role around place, looking at how places should be shaped in terms of what's needed in terms of the economy, the environment, climate. Health is going to be a huge part of this. So it's about looking at places in an integrated way, as Dr. Hills was talking about earlier. So that's the one thing. I think getting that strong governance, and I think one of the challenges is that we are going through a process of major local government restructuring in large parts of the country, so there will be evolving governance structures, but fundamentally that separation from local planning authorities and a higher authority, fully democratic, making decisions around some of the important things like housing numbers, and actually looking at integration and spatial strategy across a number of different things is going to be really important. We've seen failures in Oxfordshire and right across the board in terms of local authorities fallen by the wayside who have tried to work together. So having that separation of decision making is going to be incredibly important as we go through the process, but keeping it tight and narrow as well, not letting mission creep, means we will be able to do these really, really quickly and address some of these big challenges we've got around infrastructure deficits, around the environment. We can do these quickly. We've done them very quickly in the past, but we just need to get some of the resourcing in place and manage that process of change over time. But I think the mayors will have a huge amount of responsibility to actually lift these strategies off the page and actually deliver them.
Yeah, I need to go because we're overrunning. But so I don't know if the chair wants to carry on to hear the answer, or if you could provide a written response. But was interested in what your views are on what should be covered in national development management policies going forward, and then also if there are any other planning reforms that the government need to do to deliver this 1.5 million homes, which obviously is one of their main pledges.
Okay. Shall I? Yeah. So, I mean, I think the government's made a really good start with the MPPF and deserves a lot of credit for that and getting it in place quickly. And you know, developers are responding. So the Land Planning Development Federation reported a 160% increase in the preparation of planning applications in response to the MPPF, which will be being submitted in the first half of this year. And you know, we all know what the OBR said about that in terms of scoring the 170,000 extra homes by 2025. But there are, I think, still some significant challenges, and these really relate to the time it's going to take for those planning applications to be determined. So we're about to publish some research next week, which we can supply to the committee, looking at how long it's taken for outline planning applications for residential development of over 10 homes to be determined between 2014 and last year. And what that essentially shows is the average time it's taken has risen to 2 years, up from 8 months in 2014. In 2014, 78% of applications were determined in less than a year, and now only 36% were, and only 4% are determined within 13 weeks that statute sets as a 4% as an expectation. So, and over the same period, the number of applications of that sort has fallen by 2/3. So, you know, there were fewer than 600 of those applications were submitted last year, and then compared to 2,500 in 2014. So, you know, I think reflects that it's not just those type of applications, the volume has fallen for all types. It's actually now quicker by 6 months on average to get a decision at appeal than it is locally. So I think, you know, resources is clearly part of that, and we've heard that consistently, but I think there's also a productivity crisis in planning because the volume of applications has fallen by more than the amount of resources that seems to be going into the system and the number of officers who are administering it. So, you know, why is that? You know, policy load, challenges around you know, nutrients, viability, all of those things. But I think it's also really about the expectations of detail that we have in the system of sort of wanting to gold plate applications, wanting all the detail up front. If you commission a report for an application, you commission another report to review it. All this is sort of adding to the volume of stuff that essentially SMEs and planning departments are dealing with. So I think the question was what reforms are needed in NDMPs, and to go into NDMPs, I think there's 4 areas that it's worth thinking about. So first of all is on policy, which is the NDMPs are a real opportunity to build on the MPPF, have better codified policy tests and strengthen the presumption in favour, and have a particular small sites NDMP to support SMEs deliver small scale development, clarify the weights to be attached to certain policy factors in the planning balance so you have a clearer set of rules in terms of what does or doesn't accord with policy. There's then process points. So the Planning Inspectorate turned around its act with the Rosewell Commission, identifying the sort of end-to-end process and how that could be improved. I think a similar process is needed for local decision taking, and part of that is letting outlines be outline. You know, you look at an outline planning application now compared to one, you know, when I started out. I mean, the amount of detail that goes into that is just off the scale. It's incredible how that's changed. So that needs to move on. There's practice points around targeting efficiency gains from digitalisation and the use of AI in local authority, try and reduce the demands on applicants and officers, and while still leaving room for planning judgment. I think local authority working practices need to change, and that goes to the point Victoria Hill's made about having, you know, proper senior chief officers who can make those, you know, quite knotty but crucial planning judgments that junior officers, I think, are struggling with and almost getting policy paralysis with all the information. And then finally, it's on performance. So the official statistics on planning applications performance don't actually measure what matters, because applications keep on getting extended in time. So most applications are decided in time, even though they now take over 2 years to determine. So we need to start measuring what's actually meaningful, and that goes for statutory consultees as well. So that putting more resources in, yes, stripping back the detail, simplifying the policy, but also making we've got a better performance management regime in place.
Could I just answer the second part of that question? Just one small point. Utility companies, I'm just going to throw that in there. One of the biggest blockages on long-term planning is private sector utility companies, whether it's water companies, energy companies, and there's nothing in the bill that really forces them to the table up front. This could be, again, a real positive approach from spatial development strategies and mayors, bringing some of the utility companies to the table to actually get them to plan long term and feed in at the start of the process and not at the end of the process, when more often than not they say we can't do what you need me to do or need us to do. So generally infrastructure providers getting them to the table upstream, but actually specifically private sector utility companies, and I'm not sure what you can do about that in terms of legislation. It might be difficult to enforce, but even just getting something in the bill would send the right message.
Yeah, I think energy companies and electricity companies can be added into that as well.
Yeah, just one brief, just on the request for what topics should the National Development Management policies cover. Town centre regeneration, we used to have more guidance on this. We definitely need some new guidance on that. Affordable housing delivery, we have targets, 5-year housing land supply for general housing, but we don't have it for affordable housing, and nor do we have it for the huge growing sector of old people's accommodation. That is virtually no targets for that. And the one thing that would change the system, change paragraph 11B of the MPPF and make every local authority have to meet its housing target, because I know we've moved to mandatory targets, but the mandatory targets can still be undermined by constraints in the area, not Greenbelt now, but other constraints. Every area should meet its housing need unless and until it can find a neighbour to take it, or there's a sub-regional or regional plan, which is why we need regional plans and why the last 15 years have been, frankly, really, really difficult without regional and higher level plans. You can't plan the country's planning requirements and housing requirements focusing largely on neighbourhood plans and a patchwork of occasional local plans. The whole system needs to just get real, have plans in place meeting their housing targets, unless somebody else will meet some of your target for you.
And on that note, I think we'll bring the committee to an end. I think we'll have many of our constituents watching, recognising that, yes, they too have a voice in this, and I think ultimately they want those plans to work locally. They want to see the developments come forward, so it's about how we bring everyone together to make sure everything's working in sync. Just to thank you all for coming this morning. Order.